They didn't know I was still conscious when I hit the water. That is the detail I keep returning to, even now, sitting on my porch with the evening light going soft over the marsh. They assumed the fall would do it, or the cold, or the current that runs fast beneath the old Carver Street footbridge after a heavy rain. They assumed a great many things about me that turned out to be wrong. My name is not important. What I am is a 67-year-old woman who taught 7th grade English for 31 years, buried a husband I loved deeply, raised 2 sons mostly on her own, and made the single, catastrophic mistake of trusting the wrong one with everything she had left. Let me tell you how it began. Not that night on the bridge. It began the way these things always do, much earlier and much quieter. My husband Gerald passed in the spring 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the morning, I held his hand and watched him go. We had built something together, a modest life on the surface, though the land Gerald inherited from his father turned out to be worth considerably more than either of us had imagined when developers started buying up the county. The property, the savings, the life insurance policy, the small rental house on Birchwood, all of it together came to just over $4 million. Not a fortune, by some measures. By mine, it was everything Gerald and I had spent 40 years building quietly, carefully, without flash or waste. I was not a woman who talked about money. I was not a woman who thought about it much, if I am honest. What I thought about was my garden and my granddaughter's soccer games and the stack of novels on my nightstand, and whether the bird feeder needed refilling. Gerald had managed the finances. After he died, I was adrift in a way I had not anticipated, not just in grief, but in practicality. I did not know which accounts held what. I did not know the name of his broker. I sat at his desk for 3 evenings in a row, surrounded by folders I could barely parse, and I felt a kind of helplessness I had never felt before, not even when I was 26 and pregnant, and Gerald had just been laid off. My older son, Daniel, stepped in. He had always been the capable one, people said, the one who wore pressed shirts to family dinners, who remembered to send thank you notes, who had married a woman named Sandra, who kept an immaculate house and spoke in the careful tones of someone who had practiced being charming. He sat across from me at the kitchen table 6 weeks after Gerald's funeral and said, "Mom, let me help you. You don't need to deal with all of this alone." And I looked at my son, my firstborn, the boy I had read to sleep every night until he was 9 years old, and I felt nothing but gratitude. I signed the power of attorney in September. My younger son, Patrick, was living in Portland at the time. He called twice a week, sent flowers on my birthday, visited at Christmas with his wife and their 2 daughters. He was the softer one, people said, the one who cried at movies and coached youth baseball on weekends. He had asked me, gently, once, whether I was sure about the power of attorney. I had told him I was. He had not pushed it. That is the kind of man Patrick is. He respects other people's decisions even when he disagrees with them. I would think about that conversation many times in the months that followed. The first year after Gerald's death passed without incident. Daniel managed the accounts. He paid the property taxes on the Birchwood house, handled the insurance renewals, sent me quarterly summaries that I read cursorily, and filed without question. Sandra called me every Sunday evening, reliably, pleasantly. They invited me to their home for Thanksgiving. Daniel grilled steaks on the 4th of July and handed me a cold glass of iced tea, and everything felt, on the surface, like love. I did not see the withdrawals until February of the following year, and only then, by accident, I had gone to my bank to update the address on my account. I had been spending more time at the cottage Gerald and I kept near the coast and wanted the statements forwarded there. The woman at the desk, a young woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled up my accounts and then paused in a way that made me pause too. "Is there a problem?" I asked. She looked at the screen, then at me. She asked if I had authorized a series of transfers from my investment account over the previous 14 months. I said I had signed a power of attorney for my son. She nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they are being careful. She printed a transaction history and slid it across the counter without comment. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for a very long time after that. The number on the page was not a small one. Over 14 months, $260,000 had moved from my investment account into an account I did not recognize, not in large, dramatic lump sums that might have triggered a flag. In increments, 12,000 here, 8,000 there, 15,000 in October, the kind of movements that look, to a casual reviewer, like ordinary portfolio management. I drove home. I did not call Daniel. I did not call anyone. I want to explain this because it is the part people find hardest to understand. He was my son, not a stranger who had broken into my house, not a con artist who had targeted me through a phone call. My son, who had sat in my kitchen as a teenager, eating cereal at midnight, who had called me from college when his first relationship ended and cried in a way he would have been embarrassed by later, who had stood beside Patrick at Gerald's graveside with red eyes and a white handkerchief. When you discover that a person like that has been stealing from you, something in your mind refuses the information at first. Not because you are stupid, because the alternative that this person you have loved and trusted is capable of this requires a kind of restructuring of reality that takes time. I also knew that a power of attorney, depending on its terms, gave Daniel significant legal latitude. If I went to the police immediately, with nothing but a transaction history, he could claim every transfer was legitimate investment management, property maintenance fees, expenses he had paid on my behalf. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before I could prove anything. So I did not call the police. Not yet. I called my attorney instead. A woman named Barbara Stills, who had handled Gerald's estate and who had the blunt, unhurried manner of someone who had seen most things. I described what I had found. She said, "Don't touch anything. Don't call Daniel. Don't move money. Come see me Monday." That was Thursday. I had 2 days. I drove to the coast on Friday afternoon. I needed to think, and I have always thought more clearly near the water. The cottage was cold when I arrived. I hadn't been out in several weeks, and I opened the windows anyway and made tea and sat on the back steps, watching the light flatten over the inlet. My phone buzzed around 7 in the evening. It was Daniel. I looked at the name on the screen for a long moment, then let it go to voicemail. He left one cheerful, ordinary, asking if I'd be coming to his place for Easter. I listened to it twice. I could hear Sandra saying something in the background and Daniel laughing lightly at whatever it was, and I sat there on the back steps of my dead husband's cottage and felt something shift in my chest that I do not have a clean word for. The next morning, Saturday, Daniel and Sandra arrived at the cottage uninvited. I heard the car on the gravel and looked out the kitchen window and saw them both getting out. Sandra in a pale blue jacket, Daniel carrying a paper bag that probably held pastries from the bakery in town because that was the kind of gesture he made. The performance of thoughtfulness. I let them in. I made more tea. I sat across the kitchen table from my son and watched his face while he talked about Easter plans, about a renovation he and Sandra were doing on their guest bathroom, about a fishing trip he was thinking of taking in June. And I thought, he doesn't know I've been to the bank. He doesn't know I've spoken to Barbara. He thinks everything is exactly as it was. That realization steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. After an hour, they suggested a walk. The weather had cleared, Daniel said. The footbridge path is nice this time of year, Sandra said. You haven't been sleeping well. You told me so. Fresh air would do you good. I know this stretch of coast the way I know my own handwriting. The Carver Street footbridge crosses a tidal channel about half a mile from the cottage, and in late winter, after rain, the water below it runs fast and cold and dark. It is a lovely walk in good weather. It is not somewhere I would choose to go after 2 days of rain, on an evening when the path was still slick and the light was already going. I went anyway. I want to be precise about what happened on that bridge, because precision matters. We were standing at the midpoint of the railing, looking out at the channel. Daniel was to my left. Sandra was slightly behind me. I had my hands on the railing. Daniel was saying something about the osprey that nest in the channel pilings in spring, and I turned to look at him, and in that moment, I felt both of his hands against my back flat, deliberate, with force. And then, I was over the railing, and in the water. The cold was extraordinary. It knocked the air from my lungs in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Pure physical shock. The current took me immediately, and I went under, and came up, and went under again. And when I surfaced the second time, I could hear, above the sound of the water, Sandra's voice. "She's gone. She's gone, Danny. She's gone." And then, quieter, Daniel's voice. "The account transfers to us at confirmation of death. Get to a cell signal and call the lawyer." I did not scream. I want to be clear about that. I did not scream. Because in that moment, cold and gasping and carried by the current toward the bend, where the channel widens into shallower water near the old boat ramp, I understood something with absolute clarity. If they knew I was alive, they would come down to the bank. And I was not in a position to defend myself, so I went quiet, and I let the current carry me, and I did not look back. I have no dramatic account of those 30 minutes in the water, because survival does not feel dramatic while it is happening. It feels like a series of small decisions made with a freezing mind. Grab the piling. Don't let go. Find the bottom. Stand up. Get to the bank. Move. I came out of the water at the boat ramp, shaking so hard I could barely stand. A man was launching a small skiff and stared at me in open alarm. He gave me his jacket without my asking and asked if I needed an ambulance. I said no. I said I had slipped. He looked at me with the expression of a man who did not entirely believe this, but was not going to argue with a soaking wet elderly woman standing in the mud at dusk. He drove me to the road in his truck. I thanked him and walked the rest of the way back to the cottage alone. I want to explain why I didn't call 911 from that truck, because what I had in that moment was my word against my son's. I was a 67-year-old woman who had gone walking on a slippery footbridge in February and gone into the water. My son would say it was an accident. Sandra would say it was an accident. There were no witnesses on the bridge, and a frantic phone call made from a stranger's truck, soaking wet and shaking, without documentation, without evidence that is not a case. I needed it to be a case. I got back to the cottage. I changed my clothes. I sat down at Gerald's old desk with my laptop and I pulled up the bank's transaction history again and I looked at it for a long time, and then I picked up the phone and called Patrick. He drove through the night to reach me. By Sunday morning, I had told Patrick everything: the bank, the attorney, the bridge. He sat across the kitchen table in the same chair Daniel had occupied less than 24 hours earlier, and he cried, and then he stopped crying and became very calm in the way that calm people become when they are frightened. And he said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know if there is a camera on that bridge." There wasn't. I had already suspected there wouldn't be. It's a walking path, not a road, not monitored. But the boat ramp had a county parks camera mounted on the dockhouse, aimed at the water access. Patrick drove out there while I called Barbara Stills on her personal number and explained, in as flat a voice as I could manage, what had happened the previous evening. Barbara said 3 things. She said, "Don't tell Daniel you're alive yet." She said, "Call the county sheriff, not local police." She said, "I'll be there by noon." Patrick came back from the boat ramp with his phone showing a photograph of the camera housing. It was angled toward the ramp and the water. Depending on the angle Barbara would handle, that it might have caught me coming out of the channel. It might have caught the time frame. Combined with the medical record of hypothermia treatment, Patrick was insisting I get. And the voice memo. That last part. I should explain the voice memo. I wear a smartwatch. My granddaughter, Patrick's youngest, gave it to me 2 Christmases ago because she worried about my blood pressure and wanted me to be able to call for help easily if I needed it. I had it on when I went into the water. It is waterproof, as it turns out, and it has a feature one I had never intentionally used that detects a hard impact and automatically begins recording ambient audio. Gerald's brother had shown it to me once, said it was a safety feature for runners who got in accidents. I had forgotten entirely that this feature existed. The watch had been in a plastic bag on Gerald's desk since I got back to the cottage. Patrick picked it up Sunday morning and looked at it, and then looked at me and said, "Mom, there's a 40-minute audio file on here from last night. I have listened to that recording only once. I don't intend to listen to it again. You can hear the wind. You can hear the water. You can hear Sandra's voice, clear and unmistakable. She's gone. She's gone, Danny. She's gone." And then Daniel's voice, lower but audible, talking about the account transfer, talking about calling the lawyer. And then, as I was apparently moving away in the current, Sandra saying, "Should we go down to check?" And Daniel saying, "There's nothing to check. That current goes out to the main channel. Nobody swims out of that." Barbara arrived at noon. She listened to the recording with her eyes closed and her hands folded on the kitchen table. When it finished, she opened her eyes, looked at me, and said, "This is attempted murder. Do you understand that?" I said I did. She said, "And the financial crimes compound it. This is not a civil matter anymore. This is a criminal matter." Patrick drove me to the county hospital that afternoon. Mild hypothermia, the doctor noted, with surface lacerations on both arms consistent with contact with submerged structure. I had them document everything. I asked for copies of every record. The county sheriff's detectives arrived at the hospital. I gave them the watch. I gave them Barbara's summary of the financial transactions. I gave them the name of the man at the boat ramp, whose card I had taken without quite knowing why some old teacher's habit of collecting information, of writing things down. They arrested Daniel at his home on Tuesday morning. I was not there. I was at the cottage, sitting at the kitchen table with Patrick, when he got the call from Barbara, confirming it. Sandra was taken in for questioning the same morning and held on a charge of accessory, which was later upgraded when the financial investigation turned up transactions she had personally authorized using a secondary card linked to the account. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a particular feeling at a moment like that. And what I felt was mostly tired and sad, and something that I could only describe as a kind of grief not for what had happened to me, but for whatever had happened to my son long before the bridge, whatever turn in the road had brought him to the point of standing on a footbridge in the February dark with his hands against his mother's back. I don't know when it changed in him. I have gone over every memory I have of Daniel's adult life, looking for the moment, and I cannot find it. That is the thing that stays with me. Not the cold water, not the recording, not the long conversations with Barbara about restitution and estate recovery. The not knowing. The understanding that someone can love you or perform love convincingly enough that you cannot tell the difference and be moving toward this all along, and you will not see it. Patrick stayed with me at the cottage for 3 weeks. His wife, Claire, drove up on the weekends with the girls. My granddaughters are 9 and 12, and they do not know the full story. What they know is that Grandma had an accident and is resting and needs extra hugs, which they provide generously. The 9-year-old brings me drawings of the osprey she sees from the back steps. The 12-year-old has started teaching me to play chess, though I am a poor student. I have spoken to a therapist, at Patrick's gentle insistence. She is a woman close to my own age who does not offer false comfort, which I appreciate. She said something in our third session that I have returned to often. The fact that you cannot find the moment it changed does not mean you missed something. It may mean there was no single moment. It may mean this is simply who he chose to become. One small choice at a time, over many years. She said, "That is not a failure of your attention. That is the nature of a certain kind of person." I have moved out of the house I shared with Gerald, not because I was afraid Daniel is in custody and the Attorney General's office has been thorough, but because the house felt different to me, like wearing someone else's coat. Gerald and I had chosen it together, lived in it together, and I had been living in it alone for 4 years as a kind of tribute to what we had built. But what we had built exists in me, not in the walls. I did not need to stay inside the walls to keep it. I am at the cottage now, full time. I have had it properly winterized, and I put in a better heating system, and I ordered a new reading chair, a very good one, the kind Gerald always said we'd get around to someday. I have filled every bookshelf. I feed the birds every morning. I watch the osprey return each spring. I am 67 years old, and I have, after a very long and frightening detour, arrived at a life that belongs entirely to me. I want to say one thing to anyone listening who is older, who has been approached by a family member with an offer to help, who has been presented with a document and a reassuring voice and a cup of tea. Have your own attorney review anything before you sign it. Not a family friend, not a notary, not someone your child recommends. Your own attorney, whom you found yourself, who works for you alone. It costs less than you think, and it means more than you can imagine. Gerald's lawyer was Gerald's lawyer, and I assumed that meant he was ours. He was not. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was believing that love is a guarantee. It is not. Love is a practice. It requires showing up day after day in ways that cost you something. When the cost becomes inconvenient, some people stop paying it. You cannot always tell in advance which people those will be. What you can do is protect yourself not out of suspicion, but out of the same practical care you would give any other thing of value in your life. The marsh is very still tonight. There is a great blue heron working the shallows at the edge of the property. I have seen him here before, always just before dark, unhurried in the way that large birds are, as though time is not a concern. Gerald loved herons. He used to say they were proof that patience was not passivity. I think about that often. I was in that water for 30 minutes. I was cold and I was frightened, and I let the current carry me because the alternative was worse. And then I got out of the water. And then, carefully, over the days that followed, I gathered what I needed. I did not act from panic. I am still here. The heron lifts from the marsh now, slow and enormous, crosses the inlet in a few vast wing beats, and disappears into the tree line on the far bank. The last light is going. I pulled Gerald's old cardigan around my shoulders. I kept that, and the reading chair, and the bird feeders, and the photographs, and I sit with my tea going cold in my hands, and I think, I am still here. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything.